And on behalf of the Biochemical Society and Portland Press, I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar, which is part of our Biochemistry Focus webinar series at the Biochemical Society. So topics in this series include different research areas in molecular biosciences, as well as practical sessions to support career development. And on that theme, today's webinar is on science communication and policy, how to engage as an early career researcher. So we're featuring talks from an expert panel, and this webinar will aim to provide practical insight and advice on how to connect science with society by communicating your scientific research in a clear and engaging way to a variety of audiences. So you will also have the opportunity to ask questions via text, and we welcome suggestions for future topics and speakers to feature in our webinar series. So do get involved in the chat. Before I hand over to our first speaker, I will emphasize that questions will be asked after the final presentation, but you can send in your questions at any time during the talks. And if you have a question, please type it into the question box as shown on your screen, so it should be on the top right. And you should state who your question is for while typing your question. And that bit's underlined in my notes, so I think it's important that you should do it. And we will try to answer as many questions as we can in the time that allows. So our first speaker today is Ed Day, who's press officer at the Science Media Centre. Ed graduated from University College London with a degree in natural sciences and was an intern at the Science Media Centre in 2019. Ed then worked for a few years in scientific publishing before making the transition to science communications in August 2022 when he joined the Science Media Centre. So I'll hand over to you, Ed.
For the intro, and thanks for listening, everyone. So I'm Ed. I'm one of the press officers at the Science Media Centre. These kind of science stories were filling the front pages and were very much in the public debate. But what was kind of noticeable was there was a lack of the scientists actually doing the research in these areas being heard in the media and on the radio and on TV and in print, discussing what the state of evidence was on those topics. So there was kind of frustration from both sides here, from the scientists who would read the paper or listen to the radio and kind of hear misinformation about their area of science, but also from the journalists who would try and get in touch with the scientists and either not get a response or get a response 2 weeks later. And so those journalists wouldn't have access to those scientists to be better informed and inform the public. So we were set up as an organization to bridge that gap. So when these kind of meaty, scary, politicized kind of scientific stories come into the news, we can be in touch with all the scientists working on the areas and help connect them to the journalists so that we can inform the public as to what the kind of complicated evidence says. So we describe ourselves as an independent press office for science, and we've got a specific remit on helping the kind of mainstream news media, primarily in the UK. We run as a charity, and we're funded by over 120 different organizations like universities, science journals, research charities, and somebody from industry, but we maintain complete editorial independence from all of our funders. Our kind of remit isn't about generating coverage of interesting science in the news. It's kind of ensuring whatever science is reported on accurately and is kind of measured and evidence-based. And so kind of on that line, we don't really have a particular editorial stance or position on any of the issues that we work on. We kind of follow where the weight of the good quality scientific evidence and what the scientific weight of the scientific community think on those kind of topical scientific issues of the day. And we particularly do the kind of messy, controversial, complex, scary stories like vaccines, e-cigarettes, AI, climate change, mental health, prostate cancer screening, and kind of many more. So they're often areas that are kind of highly debated or seem highly debated in the media, but when you actually speak to the kind of scientists that have been working in these fields for 5, 10, 20 years, the science is often, there's a kind of a weight of quality science that's kind of more on one side. And we try and get the kind of just evidence-based views of those scientists into the media to help the public navigate kind of what's going on in these situations. So just quickly, our overall philosophy is we'll get the media to do science better when scientists do media better. So that's just, again, saying that it's not the responsibility of one party here. So only by scientists engaging with journalists and the journalists engaging with the scientists will we help the public better understand these kind of complex scientific issues. So it's on both parties here. And you might be thinking, why focus on the mainstream media? Doesn't everyone just look at social media anymore? Does anyone even bother reading the news anymore? But this is some data just from last year, just looking at where UK adults get their news online each week. And even though kind of print media is going down, it's to be expected. But still, if you have a look at the other figures, then then like half the UK population are getting it from TV, and nearly three quarters are getting it from an online source. So it just shows there's a huge reach of these news publications. And so if these outlets are kind of getting this information wrong, then it means the public are being kind of misinformed as to what the state of the science says. And one way to help that is by scientists engaging with those journalists to improve that coverage. And then what about kind of what the public think of the voice of scientists as well? So academics are really well trusted by the public. So this is just showing the Veracity Index. If you've not seen this before, it's the kind of poll that Ipsos, the kind of market research organization, do every year, where they ask a representative proportion of the public if they trust each of these professions to tell them the truth or not. Scientists have always been highly trusted, especially kind of if you look compared to kind of journalists and politicians. So scientists are in a really privileged position to use their kind of voice to help the public understand science, because they trust what you'll be saying as truthful. And we always kind of say this is something that it's not a given, and it has to be kind of earned and kept. And a way of doing that is being heard in the media and speaking to the public about science, and being kind of good in science and talking about evidence and nuance and complications and everything else. At the same time, there's also a risk of not engaging with the media as well. As if scientists don't kind of engage with the media, someone else will. And a news story won't stop just because a scientist isn't available or refuses to speak to a journalist on a topic. Might go to a less qualified expert or a campaigner, a lobbyist that might then give them information that could misinform the public, or a campaign they're kind of trying to push, and that will mean that the public are not kind of aware of what the actual quality of the evidence says. Just really quickly about how we actually operate. So we've got, I think this is actually a bit update. We've got nearly 4,000 scientists on our database now. So these are across all the range of science and engineering topics that are kind of appear in the media, and they've given us their permission to contact them when a journalist is looking for a scientist to speak to about a particular topic. We've also got all the relevant press officers who work with those scientists. So all those institutions those scientists are based at, we've got a good relationship with the press officers, and they'll help us to find the right experts for a particular request, and also let us know what research they've got coming out that we might work on them with, and that might be a media story in the coming days. And then lastly, we've got a really good relationship with all the journalists at the UK national news outlets. And particularly, we work with the specialist news reporters, so who just write about either science, health, environment, tech, transport, or any of those specialist areas. And I should just really quickly say that we're really lucky in the UK that we have those specialist reporters that have been, some of them working on just writing about health or science or whatever for about 5, 10, 15, 20 years, know a lot more about the scientific method, for the most part care about getting the science and evidence right and reported on proportionately. So it's a really valuable resource that we can help the public understand that science through those specialist reporters. So the kind of main 4 things that we do on a day-to-day basis to actually help achieve the goals of improving kind of public understanding of science through the media. Firstly, just journal inquiries are quite self-explanatory. So any of those journalists I mentioned can get in touch and just say, I'm looking for a scientist to speak to me about, I don't know, any kind of biochemical topic, or I don't know, the recent hantavirus outbreak or meningitis in Kent, and we'll find them an expert that can speak to them about the specifics of that issue and give them a written quote or an interview. And if you've not done media work before, these can often be a really nice way to kind of dip your toes. If it's just a written comment to one journalist, we could work on that with you and along with your press office, and then you can see the impact of that being in a news article and helping to inform that coverage. So just to really quickly go over the other main things that we do. So the first thing is what we call rapid reactions. So these are written responses from scientists into breaking news stories with an element of science to them. So we kind of monitor the news every day in our offices, and if we see a story brewing or breaking where we think scientists can kind of weigh in and help inform the public as to what's going on through the media, we kind of jump into action, go to that database that I mentioned, and ask the relevant scientists to kind of comment on, based on what information we have about the situation right now, kind of saying, what can we say about the situation right now? What can't we say? What might be going on in the next coming days? And then we send out those comments and collate them and send them out in real time to the journalists as the situation develops. So for example, again, with the kind of meningitis outbreak in Kent, we kind of kept sending out comments as there were new developments, or there was talk of like vaccinating the relevant children in Kent. And the same with the hantavirus situations that's developed over the last couple of weeks. So they're often kind of the headline story of the day and can be quite scary. So there's a huge appetite from the media to hear from scientists in this situation, to contribute to the story and help them understand it, especially if they've not kind of heard of hantavirus before, which I imagine most of them hadn't, for example. So it's an amazing opportunity to get your expertise in the media, but it can often be when the public are most engaged in concerns. So it's important that they hear from the experts best placed to comment in those situations. So just to give you a really quick example, this is an example which we'll probably all remember from a few months ago now, but where the Trump administration said that kind of Tylenol paracetamol use during pregnancy was causing rising autism in children. So the kind of US administration, and particularly RFK and Trump, have been obsessed with kind of rising rates of autism and kind of vowed to find out what the root of it was, describing it as preventable and kind of suggesting various causes like paracetamol. So they kind of cited some studies here, but there was kind of on a potential association, but obviously that's not the same as kind of causal evidence, and the evidence was kind of quite weak compared to other kind of larger systematic reviews or other studies that kind of showed the complete opposite. So this is a really good time where we can get scientists that work in kind of autism or medicines to kind of comment on what the evidence around this actually said, and send those out in real time to the journalists who will be covering this story, so that the public can understand that we're not demonizing this medicine, and that there's actually evidence that suggests that it's quite completely safe to use in pregnancy. So this is just what the kind of comments look like. We send out to journalists, and like I kind of mentioned, they're just really clearly stating that there's not robust evidence to suggest that there's any kind of causal relationship here, and that this scientist is confident that there's no relationship, despite what the Trump administration was saying. So just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all the comments in detail, but just know that we sent out 11 quotes over 7 versions throughout the day as this was becoming a story. And those quotes from scientists were used in kind of 39 different UK news articles. And that's a big underestimate because we don't monitor kind of local news coverage or broadcast. We're not very good at monitoring broadcast either. So those scientists will have actually helped to inform a big majority of the public as to when this story was breaking. And they also, if it's a big story like this, articles can keep appearing for days afterwards. And journalists can then use those quotes to also use in follow-up pieces. So they kind of help keep informing the coverage as the story develops. And then just to really quickly show you what this looks like in practice. So the journalists will take kind of chunk of these quotes and then include them directly in their article to show what third-party scientists think of these claims, like in this Telegraph piece here, breaking down each of the claims the Trump administration made and showing that scientists think it's kind of BS. And the same in the Times here. And then that's just kind of one example of the major rapid reactions we worked on. And kind of the best people to comment in these situations is the scientists that work in these areas to help inform the public when they're kind of at their most scared. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was roundups. So these are kind of one of the unique things we did at the SMC. So in most areas of science, research tends to enter the news media through a press release, which is like a summary of that bit of research. We're in a privileged position at the SMC where we receive all those press releases as the journalists do. So we have a bit of a window into their inbox, and we kind of see what stories they might cover in the next few days. And then what we do is we gather third-party comments critiquing the new studies where with a study that we think the journalists will cover, and it's on a kind of controversial, messy, politicized kind of topic where we think it could be exaggerated or sensationalized. And we get those scientists to provide a mini peer review on that study, commenting on how good quality it is, what kind of evidence it is it an RCT, is it observational, are there any limitations over speculation? And they help the journalists work out how good quality it is and how to report on it. So just for another quick example, we did a roundup on a study that was going to be published in one of the JAMA journals, JAMA Network Open, suggesting weight loss drugs were associated with increased risk of suicidality. So weight loss drugs have been one of the biggest stories in the media for the last couple of years. I think even now, this was 2 years ago, they're still in the news every single day, covering every single facet of them. We're fascinated with them, but one big thing that the media love reporting on them is kind of side effects, because it's a really popular medication, then there's scary side effects. So this one kind of ticks all the boxes. So it's could be a good one where we could get comments from scientists talking about the fact that this is probably not causal, it's probably an association, but we need to make that clear. Could it be the opposite, where if you're taking weight loss drugs, you might be possibly more likely to have kind of body image issues that might make you at a high risk of suicidality? So these are all the kind of things we can help the journalists unpick by getting scientists to comment on the study. This is just the paper. what we see, and we kind of send that to the scientists. They can comment on it. And then just showing you some of the comments. And like I said, you can see that the scientists, so this one's from a professor of statistics and kind of research methods, pointing out the fact that it's an association. And then just showing you some more comments from kind of people that look at side effects from drugs, so pharmacoepidemiologists. Also kind of mentioning that that there's limitations here and that it could be this reverse causality or reverse association that I mentioned as well. So really clearly making those points to the journalists about what the kind of limitations of the study. And then just again showing you that these comments are really useful to the journalists, and they particularly take up these points to show that the paper has major limitations in that nice section at the end of the Telegraph article. And then just showing you how much they're used, because all these big chunks are all the quotes used from scientists in this PA piece that then will have gone out to lots of local and national news media, highlighting the limitations of the study. And then also a really nice thing is that when these comments comment on how weak the study is, sometimes journalists can use that as a justification not to cover the article at all. And so in this case, because the evidence was quite weak and might scare the public, a couple of journalists wrote to us and said they even decided not to cover it because of the comments from scientists, which is a good result. I hope I'm doing all right for time, but I've just got one more thing to talk about. So that's our media briefings. So we run two main types of briefings, background briefings and news briefings. So news briefings are pegged through a new study or a new report, and they're a great way for those scientists who've done that big bit of science to present and explain their results in their own way to the journalists, kind of be proactive, have their 20 minutes to explain exactly all the ins and outs of their science. And they're also a nice way for journalists to understand it more, because there's a Q&A afterwards where they can ask their sciencey questions and dig into all the details as well. So they're a really nice opportunity to help get better coverage by having that hour to explain all the science. So background briefings are a bit different from news briefings in that they're not pegged to a new bit of science. They give a scientific background and kind of answer questions on a broader scientific topic. So this could be a cutting edge area of science journalists haven't covered before. Like I ran one on kind of driverless cars coming to London, because there's going to be a trial of that later this year. Or it could be an area of science that kind of keeps coming back into the media, but perhaps the public are being misled on what the state of the evidence says. So for example, I ran one on kind of prostate cancer screening last year, just to talk about the ins and outs of what the evidence says and complexity say around prostate cancer screening, because that was a big news story around lots of campaigners kind of wading in and saying that we should introduce screening. So the example I'm going to talk today is about a news briefing. So this is a really nice example, which was around a couple of scientific papers from last year that confirmed a new IVF technique to reduce the risk of kind of mitochondrial diseases from parents their children had worked. And for the first time, 8 healthy babies that would have otherwise had the mitochondrial disease were born. Just for a bit of background, the development of this technology had been going on for years to get to that point. And they were initially dubbed kind of 3-parent babies technique in the 2000s, as this technique involves kind of taking healthy mitochondrial DNA from a third-party person and putting that into the mother to prevent the transfer to the children. When the media rarely covered it without saying kind of playing God, designer babies, all those kind of eugenics, all those kind of things that kind of were classic in the kind of 2000s, 2010s when talking about kind of gene editing or any kind of novel treatment involving children. So this is just the invite that we sent out for this briefing to the journalists, but kind of between 2002, when the SMC first opened, in 2015, when we sent out this briefing invite, and the treatments were legalized in the UK, the SNC ran 5 separate press conferences on that research at every stage of development. So from the kind of early lab-based research to the birth of those children, the researchers that were involved in developing the technique throughout, and all the organizations that were involved basically engaged proactively and openly with the UK science and health journalists. So rather than seeing it as a threat, talking to the journalists, they saw that as every opportunity, every new bit of science as an opportunity to kind of get with the journalists in a room and with the researchers themselves or the relevant scientists, or the kind of funders, patient research charities and regulators, to really help them understand the complex science and its implications. So, I mean, questions from journalists rightly asked about the kind of uncertainties about the science, the risks and criticism, but rather than kind of shying away from them, they engage with them openly, with everyone in the mix, kind of understanding that we kind of can't get the public to understand this unless we explain all the complexities and the uncertainties here. And that's kind of led to the very kind of acceptance we saw in the coverage today. So that's just showing the 2 articles. And as this story was going for so long, as you can see, these briefings are really useful for journalists, as there was attended by about 40 or 50 national and international news journalists to help come and understand this complex science here. And then this was just some of the journalists in the room. The previous slide was the journalists online. So they're a really nice way for those 4 scientists in different areas of embryology to really dig into all the detailed complex science here. And this is just showing a couple of journalists interacting with those scientists afterwards. So just to show these briefings are a really nice way for those journalists to really get to grips with the science. So there's Mary Herbert, one of the scientists, explaining some of the complex embryology to Ian Sample at The Guardian. And they also lead on to nice broadcast coverage. So a couple of the scientists there doing broadcast coverage, and on the right, a couple of the correspondents at the BBC and Sky News doing an explainer that will have been helped by having those scientists explain how each step works in the process of this mitochondrial DNA transfer technique. And then just showing it was across all the front pages the next day as well. So I kind of rushed through that. I hope I haven't gone too much over, but thanks so much for listening. I hope that gave you a few examples of who we are at the SMC, and the kind of important role that scientists can have when your areas of science are hitting the headlines in helping the public kind of understand what's happening and informing them as a result. So I've left my details there. If anyone's interested in signing up to our database that I mentioned, then please do get in touch with me and I'll be happy to get that sorted after this. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Ed. Any questions, do type them in the Q&A box, and we will get to them at the end. But for now, thank you again, Ed. And I'd like to invite our second speaker, Dr. Rebecca Hill, Public Opinion and Involvement Manager at CASE, which is the Campaign for Science and Engineering. And Rebecca has a PhD in molecular biology from the University of Sheffield and joined CASE in April 2022 to lead the delivery of public opinion insights, including overseeing collection and analysis of public attitudes research, and to directly involve public voices in policy processes. She previously worked in policy positions at Cancer Research UK and the fact-checking charity Full Fact. And before that was a journalist at publications including Research Fortnight. So lots of interesting things there, and I'll hand over to Rebecca. I can see your slides, so take it away.
Thank you very much. Really nice to be here, and very much appreciate the chance to talk about what it is that we do at CASE. But first I'm going to run through a little bit of a potted history of my career, and I'm going to give a bit of a sense, hopefully, of some of the things that I did and why it's important to engage in different ways, and then hopefully give some quick tips on how you could potentially engage with science and research policy. So I started my career in research. I did my undergrad and PhD at Sheffield. That is a picture of me doing my PhD, which dates how old it was, because you can see by the age of the computers, and that I've aged quite a lot since then. But I very quickly realised into my PhD that I just didn't want a career in research. So I started doing different things. That included setting up a science communication group. It was called Brainwaves. We did lots of outreach, and that's us at a music festival doing a little stall called Einstein's Kitchen. I also did a bit of journalism, and I had internships at the SMC, and also Centre About Science, which promotes public connection with evidence of science. And I would say that those internships are a fantastic way to get a better sense of what you can do outside of science that isn't being an active researcher. Essentially, I eventually decided to pursue a career in journalism. I went to City University to do a master's in science journalism. I got to write for The Times every week. I went on a placement there every week for a year. And then after that, freelanced at these outlets, as well as some other bits and pieces as well. I'm super happy to talk about my experiences of being a freelancer and of being a journalist, but I'm going to sort of keep cantering through. I then went on to work in staff jobs at trade press. So I would say that for thinking about researchers and engagement, trade press is quite a good place to start, because they know your sector inside out and they write about policy areas. So Research Fortnight wrote about research policy. At Civil Service World, it was a sort of online and physical magazine aimed at, as you might guess, civil servants. And I write about government, IT and tech. And then the Register is focused for IT and tech, sort of people who work in those sectors. And I wrote about data protection, privacy and surveillance. So I've written a lot about policy through my whole career. I became a bit disillusioned with the media and being a journalist, which again, happy to talk about in Q&A. And then eventually decided I wanted to do policy. So I went to get a job at Full Fact, which is a fact-checking charity, checks and challenges claims made in the press, made by politicians and made online, as you might imagine. And there I did quite a lot of interesting things. So it was a very small team. So I did sort of work to try and develop policies. I also, or policy recommendations for governments. I also tried to influence sort of policymakers to enact some of those changes, engaged a lot to try and correct misleading claims, which is the picture in the middle, and then also wrote sort of big reports that considered different aspects. I was there during the pandemic, which was fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. And I would really emphasize, just to kind of build on what Ed has said about the ability of scientists and experts to challenge potential misinformation, organizations like Full Fact really do like experts because they need to be able to call on them, they need to be able to sort of find and access that sort of information. So these are also ways that you can sort of get your research and your expertise out into the world to really help provide members of the public and politicians with good information that you can sort of build a really robust decision on, regardless of what decision you make. Then I went on to work for Cancer Research UK. The policy areas I worked on were early detection, diagnosis, health data, and also charity policy. That was very focused on developing policy recommendations rather than so much of the campaigning and sort of influencing stuff that I talked about a little bit at Full Fact. After that, I came to CASE. I didn't actually spend very long at CR UK because this job came up that was a perfect blend of sort of comms, public engagement, and policy and advocacy work. So with that potted history of my career, I'm going to talk about CASE now. So policy and public opinion, and basically who are CASE, first of all, and then why do we do what we do and why do we care? So CASE is an independent organisation. We're non-partisan, we're a charitable organisation, and we represent the views of organisations across the R&D sector. So they join us as members, they pay a fairly reasonable membership fee. Biochemical Society are a member. And they can be universities, research institutes, as I say, learner societies, we have medical research charities, and we also have businesses. So they're very broad membership in terms of the different types of work that they do, and also broad ranging across disciplines. We're called science and engineering, but we really do span broader than just that into sort of social sciences and humanities and arts as well, anything that does research, really. And what we want to do, we exist to try and influence political leaders, decision makers, to make decisions that will benefit the research system. And how do we do that? Well, first of all, we want to start with evidence. It's really important to us that our policy is evidence-based. So we provide evidence-based recommendations to policymakers or decision makers. So it could be political leaders in any of the UK's governments, but it could also be the people who run funders, the people who run really big sort of research organisations or universities as well, because we all sort of contribute to the way the research system runs. So we do that by engaging with people from across the sector. So we might run a workshop or a discussion to try and understand what are the problems people are facing and try and come up with solutions that are sort of practical, achievable, which we then essentially set out to those decision makers and try and influence them to actually enact those changes. It's not just about sort of giving them evidence and hoping that our independent analysis will convince them. We really need to be that voice for R&D to decision makers. So we might speak directly to policymakers in government or civil servants, who are a really good way to engage to sort of, because they do a lot of the work on the ground. We might do this behind closed doors and sort of meetings and sort of influencing. We might bring them into some of our discussions and workshops. We might write public letters or publicly make calls, and that might be in the press for something to change, or we might see that a budget is coming up and we might get a group of people together from across the sector and lead what we might call an open letter that says we really call on the government to protect science funding, or we call on the government to address this particular issue that we care about. And we would do that as a group of organisations from across the sector, because that demonstrates that we're all speaking with one voice and we're all really arguing for the same thing. And that is often a very effective way of doing it, particularly being able to sort of call that out in public. I'm very happy to sort of talk a bit more about the way that we do some of that work, but I'm conscious of time as well. So just a little bit on the types of things that we cover. We're a very broad organisation, so we run as an umbrella, I would say, across different sort of disciplines. So there might be areas that are very specific to a very particular type of research organisation. they would focus on those, and we see this sort of big picture umbrella almost. So we'll think about things that affect the research system overall. That might be things like the sort of skills and talent pipeline. It might be immigration, the ability for researchers to come to the UK. It might be the amount of money that's invested in research and the science budget overall. And we develop recommendations and we put those forward to decision makers, and we really seek, as I said, to try and influence them to make those changes. My work, I work within the public opinion team. So we focus on trying to understand what the public think and feel about R&D, and really try and use that to find better and more resonant ways to engage with different parts of our society. I think it's helpful for me to say why do we care about doing this? So first, I think it's important for our sector to open up and talk about R&D. We spend a lot of money, a lot of taxpayer money on R&D, and we want to be able to give a really clear and compelling justification for why we're doing that, and particularly when public finances are so tight and people are really struggling, to have an open conversation about why it is that we think it's valuable to continue to put that money into R&D. And then there's a practical reason which links back to the policy aspect, which is that if we want supportive decisions for R&D, we need to build that support for R&D among the public as well, because that will bolster our case for political support. If we don't have public support, it kind of just makes it easier for political decision makers to make decisions that are against R&D, because they know there won't be a backlash, there won't be people calling them out. It's not something that would upset public opinion. So that's another sort of two sides to the same coin. We do a huge amount of work at CASE. I don't have time to talk about all the stuff that we do, but here are just a few examples. So on the left, it's the cover of a major study we did last year, which is an 8,000 person poll of public attitudes, along with a lot of qualitative work like focus groups. And we really asked lots of broad questions. So do people know what R&D is? Do they care about it? Do they think it benefits them? Do they support investment in it? Do they want to hear more about it? What do they think the benefits are, if there are any? Those sorts of questions. In a nutshell, we find that public support for R&D is broad, but quite shallow. It doesn't feel very tangible, and a lot of the bits of it are quite opaque. On the right-hand side, we did a piece of work trying to speak to people who had more anti-immigration stances about research and immigration. And at the bottom is a project we're running at the moment, trying to understand how an increasingly polarized voter landscape in both directions might have an impact on R&D, and how can we have better conversations about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about engaging with research policy and how you might want to do that. There's so many ways, so I'm just going to try and pick a few different examples. So you can do that directly with either government or parliament. So you can see here the 4 devolved parliaments. So you've got Westminster, and then you've got parliaments in the other nations, so Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And you can, just going to pick a couple of examples. So in Westminster, there are committees of MPs and Lords in the Commons and the Lords that are focused on different areas. So there are ones on science, innovation, and technology, and they'll run inquiries almost consistently. They'll be running at least one, and you will be able to sort of submit evidence to them. So there'll be a call that goes out for written evidence, and you can sort of fill in that, depending obviously on the topic. It needs to be something that you care about. And there's also opportunities to give oral evidence too. So a few sort of base tips on submitting evidence, which is remember to use plain language. And if you can think about what your key takeaways are, what you really want people to hear, and summarize those at the top. You can go into them in more detail later on, but it's really about trying to get your core messages across, because the staff who read these will have hundreds to read potentially. The same goes for government consultations. So the more you can spell out your key points, the better it will be, and the more likely you are to sort of get that message across. There are also people running these committees and people running these inquiries, so you can email them directly, and that's a particularly good way if you want to give oral evidence. So if you want to sit in front of the committee and actually talk about what it is that the issue is that the inquiry is looking into. If you've seen these on telly with ministers, they are not as harsh to the independent experts that come in as you might see the grilling that some of these sort of ministers or very senior civil servants get. Also make sure that you check the final reports after you submit evidence to see if you've been referenced, and I'm sure that your impact teams at your institutions will thank you for doing it too. You can also engage directly through different interest groups that are run across different parties. They're called APPGs or CPGs in the devolved nations. And parliamentary websites also have information you can search. So Hansard is an official record of everything that's said in Parliament. And you can put in your keywords and you can see if there's particular MPs or Lords who are talking about the things you care about. And you could even reach out to them directly and say, are you going to debate this again? Are you thinking about tabling a question to the rest of Parliament? Would you like to have a chat about this issue? I really care about it. And that is something completely legitimate to do. But you can also do it through sort of intermediaries. And I'd really recommend sort of thinking about networks or representative bodies. Biochemical Society is an organisation you can do it through. CASE is an organisation you can do it through. So people do care about hearing from experts, and in particular, different people. There's a real lack of new and diverse voices. Sometimes you hear from the same people over and over again. So putting yourself out there might be a bit scary, but also you might get a really positive reception. So on the left, these are just a few places that you might get advice from. You can also do policy internships, and the Royal Society does a pairing scheme, which I've not done, but it does sound really cool, where you get research scientists and parliamentarians or civil servants, and they kind of like pair with each other and shadow each other and see what real life is like. There's also other intermediaries like the media. So Ed's obviously told you about the SNC, not going to bother with that. But there's other outlets, so Research Professional News, which is where I used to work. You can sort of publish, you can sort of go to them and talk about what you can offer a quote to them, or you could possibly pitch an opinion piece, so a comment piece that comes from you, and this is what you particularly feel about an area. That's on more of the policy side. The Conversation is a great outlet, I would say, for academics, because it really is just academics who write for the conversation, but it's edited by journalists. So you will get a lot of guidance to nail your message and like really be really concise about what it is that you want to say. And you can talk about, and that talks about your research, and it sort of links into policy. So that's a really great sort of outlet and a good sort of intermediary to influence, because obviously politicians and decision makers do read other sort of, they read the news and they read some of these outlets. So it's a good way to sort of indirectly influence. And then the final thing, I think I'm a little bit over, but I just can't go without putting a graph in from the work that we do, which is just to emphasize not to forget the public. Public engagement, science communication doesn't sit separately from policy. They really, really impact each other. And I can't emphasize enough that so many of the public don't feel connected to R&D. And if we can't tell a good story by the people who really care about it, you know, people who work in research are the people that the public want to hear from. And the more that we can talk to people, bring them closer to our world, engage with them better, the more we'll be able to make a stronger case to political leaders. So we've got a lot of advice on engaging the public and also engaging politicians, which is on that toolkit, which is the QR code there. And just want to emphasize really with this graph that there's loads of interest to hear directly from researchers, and that's something that I think sometimes we forget, but the public really likes independent experts and they really, really want to hear from you. So that would be the final point to end on. And I'll stop sharing now. Sorry if I've gone a little bit over time.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Remember to keep those questions coming. I can see there are some coming in, but we'll get some more. And I'll now invite our third and final speaker to take the stage. Dr. Hayley Luxton is Head of Research, Impact and Engagement at Prostate Cancer UK. Hayley was trained as a researcher, but now specialises in research communication, public engagement, and helping researchers share their work beyond academia. Hayley works closely with research communities to build skills, confidence and impact through effective communication. Take it away, Hayley. I can see your slides.
Fab, thank you. I hope you can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Fab. So thank you very much for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit about my background and about science communication and engagement. So I'm going to split my talk into 3 different sections. I'm going to give you a brief history of me. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think psychom and engagement matters. And then I'm going to finish hopefully with a few practical tips. So brief history of me. So I was the first member of my family to go to university. I specifically went to Aberystwyth because at the time it was the only institution where you could do genetics and biochemistry. I think at the time you either did one and you did a little bit of the other, and I wanted to do both. As part of that, I did a year in industry, and I worked for a company which was called Saltech, which I think is now called UCB, and everyone there had a PhD, so I decided that I needed to get myself one of those too. And my family are quite musical, and there was a project advertised to work in Cambridge on a protein called lyric, and I believe that the universe looks after us, so I was like, that's a calling. So I applied for that PhD, so that accounted for the next 4 years. And then I did a number of postdocs at Manchester, Cambridge and London, and I managed to find a picture of the Patterson in Manchester with a nice blue sky. It wasn't very blue when I was there. And in 2018, I moved into the charity sector. So I'm going to take the slide from the bottom up. So what triggered the move? In my last year's postdocing, I might be misremembering, but it feels like I was on 3-month contracts for about maybe up to a year, maybe a little bit more. So there was a lot of instability and you could never plan for anything. So I wanted a new challenge, but it had to come with some stability. I enjoyed working in the lab. I enjoyed the pace of it. So I wanted something that was fast paced. And I also wanted to use my scientific network and my skills. I decided quite early on what organisation I wanted to join. No surprises, it was Prostate Cancer UK. But it actually took me about a year and maybe 3 different interviews for 3 different roles before I found the right one for me. So I think the take home from that is if you really want something, keep going for it. It will happen. So this is my plotted path. So I started with the organisation as a research officer, took a slight pay cut, and you'll see, but it was only a 6-month contract, but where I used to be on 3-month contracts, that was actually a double in my stability. Someone in the senior management team of the team had some maternity leave, so there was an opening to become a senior research officer, which I did for a year. And within that year, I kind of found a niche. At the time, the organisation just had a funding team. They didn't have an impact function as such. And I was like, oh, there's an opportunity here. So I spoke to the director and the assistant director at the time, and between us, we created a new role, which was the Research Impact and Intelligence Manager. You'll notice I started in March 2020 and there was something else going on in the world in March 2020. So the start of my career as an impact manager was a bit rocky. But when I came back from furlough and I was able to really kind of get stuck into the world of research impact. I then became a senior research impact intelligence manager, and then again I noticed that there was a niche, and that niche this time round was engagement. I realised that we're very good at funding really good research and we're really good about talking about research, but there's a need to engage with the researchers to make sure that there's a community to do the research that we want to fund going forward. So I kind of see it as a little bit of a cycle. And I felt that me and my team had quite a big role to play in terms of engaging with the researchers as a community. Moving on, if my slides will move, to why SciComms and engagement matter. So I think SciComms is really important. I think you've already heard from the previous speakers why it's important, so maybe I won't labour these points too much. But I think the ability to talk about your research and the work that you're doing and why it's important is really key. And if you can't do it, then there's going to be few people out there who are going to do it for you. So it's a skill that I think is really important to develop. And engaging is also really important. We've heard before from previous presentations, it's really, you know, people want to engage with research, they want to know more. And this is a picture from a fundraising event that we hold, and it kind of talks about, we call it precision medicine, but what it really means is giving the right treatment to the right man at the right time. And what better way to replicate that or to show that is to have a hoopla game where you've got colour-coded hoops that have to go on to the right colour-coded man. So I actually find the engagement aspect of my job the fun bit, because this is where you get to think of analogies and you get to share them and test them with supporters, with your friends, with your family, and you kind of get to have a play with kind of what works and also to find out what doesn't as well. So this is where I'd like to spend most of my time, and it's a few top tips. So something I was introduced to a very long time ago is something called KISS. Now, I don't agree with the word stupid. I tend to use sugar or sweetheart, depending on how well I know you. But I think the keep it simple message is really key. I'm not expecting you to be able to read this image on the left, but I hope you can read the keep it simple part. So I think when you're trying to talk about your research, it's really important to focus on what your take-home message is. Some junior members in my team, when they're trying to communicate a complex paper, they'll try and convey everything because they too have recently been researchers, and they understand that it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy and effort to get something published, and they don't want to diminish that. But what's really important to remember is that when you're communicating about your research, you have to have a really strong take-home message. And actually, when I ask people, what's a really cool thing about this? What's a bit that kind of makes you go, oh, that's awesome, or that's new, or that's exciting? That's the bit that I ask them to focus on, and that's a message that I try and get them to land. It's really challenging for people who are new in my team because they feel that they're understanding the research, they're kind of underplaying it, but I think it takes bravery to keep things simple, but also an understanding that it's really important to understand what the message is that you're trying to get across and to really focus on that message. And then the last point there is, I guess, just to remind us all that practice makes perfect. So if you don't get it right the first time, that doesn't mean give up. That means tweak something, try something different, and then try again. What I wanted to do, I'm not sure how clear this has come out, is to map a kind of a simple communication journey for your PsyComms, and that's really to start with the audience. What do your audience care about, and also what do they know? So when I was a researcher, I used to spend a lot of time talking to support groups. So these would be men who didn't have much knowledge on science, but they knew what it was like to live with prostate cancer. But that would be a very different audience if I was talking at a board conference that had broad scientific knowledge, but maybe not prostate cancer knowledge. And it would be different again if I was talking to a prostate focused meeting. So understanding your audience is really important because that tells you where you need to pitch your message. The next point is to think of that key message, and sometimes there might or there might not be a call to action. So the world I live in now, the call to action is normally make a donation, but the key message is the important part of that point. What is the thing that you're trying to communicate to people? What's the important thing that you want people to take away? This has already come up, but it's really important to use plain language and to avoid jargon. I naturally speak in very simple terms. Big long words scare me. So I think that partly makes me quite a good science communicator because I'm always looking for the easier, simpler word to use instead of photosynthesize or something like that. Next, lead with the so what. So it comes back to what is that key message, but also a little bit more than what the key message is, but kind of what's the importance behind, what's the impact of that message, what's the difference that that message means or is going to make. And then point 5 is tell a story. So I think as people who research, we understand when you're writing a paper, you ask a question, you develop some methods to answer that question, you show your findings, and then you put that into context and show the meaning. In my world, that means we have for each grant that we fund, we have a web page that describes that grant, and if you go on there, you'll see that they've all got very consistent headings. They start with why did we fund this project, what did the team do, what did the team achieve, and this last one's really important because for us as an organization, this is all what this is why we exist. What does it mean for men? So it puts it back into the context. Then you need to practice, and this could be in many different formats. So if you're talking in a presentation, practice your elevator pitch. Then practice a flash talk. So you've got a little bit more time. What are the next bits that add in that next layer, that extra bit of context? Maybe you've got a keynote, so you're going to have to build in some more context, some more background maybe. So kind of start building up that picture. And same could be true for written word. So if you haven't got a lot of space, like if you're doing a Blue Sky post, that's going to be very short. If you're doing a LinkedIn post, you've got more freedom. If you're writing a blog, you've got even more freedom. So again, kind of think about your audience, but also where's this going to land. I think feedback is invaluable. I think it's really one of the most important skills in whatever you do is to be able to give, but also to receive feedback, and to receive it really well. A phrase that I use and I love is that feedback is a gift, and who doesn't like to get a present? So I think it's really important that when you're given feedback that you, if you can, you act on it and you use it, because it's always given with the intention to improve. And then the last point is just to build your confidence. And again, that comes back to practice. Practice makes perfect. So the more you do, the more mistakes you make, as long as you're learning from your mistakes, the better you're going to be. I was also asked for some advice on transitioning to more of an impact role. So these are my bits of advice. I'm not going to read them because you can read them, and I understand you're going to get a copy of these slides anyway. But just to say, when I moved from research into charity, I didn't know, but I wanted to be an expert on research impact. That's something that's developed since I've joined the organisation. But what I did do was I volunteered for events. So I volunteered for Prostate Cancer UK's fundraising event, and that's where I got to know the team, but also that's where I got to talk to men about research and to really build that engagement. And when I did my PhD at the Cambridge Institute, I was the chair of the first graduate society. So I instigated things like journal clubs. We had a social entertainment society. We'd run lecture series, and I'd made sure that I always got feedback from people that said how wonderful all these different events were, so that when we did the next event, people could see, oh yeah, that's a worthwhile event because of XYZ. I'll go to that. So I guess to start where you are, and then just build on that. I hope that all made sense. Thank you for listening and for your attention, and I'll hand back to the team now.
Thank you so much, Hayley, and thank you to Ed and Rebecca as well. So we're running slightly over, but we will carry on with questions. So please keep asking your questions in the box. And I will start to ask questions now we have all of our speakers up. So I'll start with Ed, because Ed's questions have come up first. If you're ready. So do the journalists at SMC typically come from a scientific background or more of a communications/journalism background, Ed?
That's a good question. I'm pretty sure most of them come through from not a science background. There are a few, like I think Nicola Davis at The Guardian was a neuroscientist or something, but for the most part, they're not science specialists, but they just kind of build up that knowledge over time. I wouldn't say, I guess that makes your job then even more important as a researcher trying to help them understand it, because I guess if they're not a scientist, then as you've got to break it down for them in terms that they can understand, which then they can relate to the public. Because if we want the public to understand, good science communication, like Hayley mentioned, involves breaking stuff down from jargon. If the public don't if you're going to speak to your mum at the pub and she doesn't understand it, then no one else is going to understand it. So I guess they're not scientists, but it also is kind of beneficial in some ways that they aren't scientists, because it means they can break it down in a really effective way. Yeah.
And would you say that other people at SMC are scientists as well? Or is it a mix?
So that's the journalists I'm talking about at the newspapers. At the Science Media Centre, most of us all come from a science background. So I don't have a PhD, but I did an undergrad at UCL, like you mentioned. So yeah, we all have that science knowledge to help the scientists who are writing comments for journalists. We've got that bit of science knowledge to help them understand what they're talking about, but also that knowledge of the media to help kind of break it down from jargon as well. So we're kind of at the bridge.
Thanks. I'll ask you one more question while you're here. This person says, while I strongly agree on the importance of maintaining ties with mainstream media, how do we collaborate with social media platforms to address any misinformation and disingenuous coverage?
Well, there's Full Fact. They're good at looking at social media, so they often a lot of times stories now will come from a journalist. They'll say they've seen a TikTok post that's talking about some misinformation about science, and then they'll write a national news article about the social media post. So we will often help the journalists who are writing that story, or will help Full Fact who are looking into those social media posts and trying to myth bust those social media posts. Universities now, there's a lot of we're also having discussions around this of whether there probably is a kind of proportion of the public, even though most of the public still kind of looking at national news sources, there's probably a proportion of younger people that aren't looking at BBC online, or aren't looking at kind of BBC on TikTok or anything, so they're not getting any national news media source. So there probably is a proportion of the public we're missing, and we recognise that. And we're currently having discussions about how we might engage with certain social media influencers, whether we could send them the same content that we send to journalists and see if they'd use it. But there's a lot of thought that needs to go into that, because they're not the same as journalists. They're not trained in journalism. They're not they don't have their own kind of regulator to kind of uphold standards. So it's an active discussion that we're having, and I know a lot of universities are having those discussions about whether to engage with influencers to help kind of prevent or try and tackle misinformation on social media as well.
Great, thank you. Question for Hayley. What is your best advice for pre-doctoral researchers to get involved in science communication?
Oh, good question. Pre-doctoral, so we're talking about bachelor's?
I assume so, or maybe someone who's not finished their PhD yet, maybe?
Yeah. I think my best advice, or at least what I did, was go to local support groups for whatever background disease topic that you're working in, because even if you don't have data to present, you can then start talking to the people that are affected by what you're working on, and you can then just maybe have one-to-one conversations with people about what are their challenges they're finding, how does your work fit into the bigger picture. And I think that would help you kind of talk about your research, but talk about it in a way that people affected by whatever it is you're working on can understand and appreciate. And I think it's a really good two-way system, because as a researcher, I definitely found I got buoyed by their response and their enthusiasm for what I was doing. And also I really felt that my work was meaningful, and it reminded me that actually, if that experiment doesn't work, or that thing that I'm doing is a bit tricky, it kind of gives me that motivation to kind of stick at it and to try again, because there's this person I spoke to at this event that finds my work really important. So I think local support groups are a really good place to start. But also your friends and family. Just get your friends and family interested in what you're doing, and like use them as a sounding board for what you're doing, and kind of, does this phrase make sense? Do you understand what I mean when I say this? The amount of times as a team we've talked about the term protein, because my team understand that we're talking about something that's made of amino acids, whereas my dad would be like, why is chicken important? So it's about your language, and keeping it simple, but also kind of understanding what different people understand from different words that you're using.
Great, thank you, Hayley.
Well, I was going to add something there as well.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, speak to your communications department at your institution as well. So if you just do a search for your institutional comms office or press office, they'd have really great advice for you. They often have like kind of media training or science communications training opportunities that you can get involved with.
I was actually going to have a question related to that.
Okay.
So what would you do? So maybe not every institution will have a press office, and certainly not every institution has a good press office. So if I, I should say my department's press office is great. I'm not saying that, but if, for example, I was in an institution that had didn't have one that I thought was taking me seriously, where should I go? How should I start doing my communication?
If you want to do media engagement, then you come to the Science Media Centre. If you're, so we specifically have, so the criteria for getting on our database is having a PhD, so being like in a postdoc position, but it can be early postdoc.
Yeah.
But otherwise, happy to get you on our list. And then we provide kind of, we don't provide specific media training, but anytime that you do an engagement with the media, we will provide you advice. So like if you're doing an interview, we could help chat that through with you, or if you're giving a comment, we'll look at it and make sure it can't be taken out of context.
Brilliant. Thank you.
So we provide
I
advice.
think broadly as well from the SciComms, I think we've talked about the negatives of social media, but also, you know, using social media because different platforms have different limitations. So on things like X and Blue Sky, you have to be very succinct. LinkedIn, you've got a bit more freedom. You could look at maybe starting a blog. I guess it just depends on your passion and what's driving you, and kind of, do you have enough of a series of blogs, or, you know, do you want to update people on social media? So I think absolutely what Ed says, but also you can start small and then you can build. I think the important thing is to practice, to find something that you can do regularly, and then you can get good at it.
Yeah.
And can I just add a couple of like thoughts of like networks outside of, because obviously if you haven't got somewhere that's a press office, or, you know, your institution maybe isn't of the size that you can do that, there are other organisations like the British Science Association has lots of branches. So there might be one of those locally, which might be a way into different types of engagement and communication that's not necessarily written. There's also organisations like NCCPE. I think it's the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement, which is a university-based network, but there's lots of them, of like these different types of networks that might be helpful about public engagement. And there's one in Scotland called ScotPen and stuff as well. So there's lots of these different networks, and I think it is about making those connections with people who are doing the same things as you, which just gives you that bit of peer support as well, to just make you feel like you're part of a community. And there's lots of different organisations like that.
Okay, great. I know Rebecca and Ed can hang on for a few more questions if that's okay, but I know that Hayley might need to leave. So you can stay for as long as you like, but I just wanted to thank you before you go.
Thank you. I do have to go, but thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, I have some other questions in the chat for Dr. Hill. Thank you for that insightful talk. I'd like to ask, how would you say that attitudes towards research and science in general have shifted, at least in the government and policy making sphere in the UK over these years, speaking in light of what we're seeing in the US?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It is a tough one. I think, like, if you look really big picture, we are at a point where we've had decades of really supportive, like fundamentally supportive political decisions and supportive governments who. And I think back to the time that I was reporting on science policy when I had my first staff jobs, and that was in sort of 2012-ish. And you would listen to a budget, like a big budget speech in Parliament, and you wouldn't hear science mentioned. You might get it mentioned once, and you'd be like, oh, fantastic, it's in there. And now it's become much more part of that sort of national conversation, I think, like legitimately. So there has been a change in that sort of sense. And I think there is a recognition from people who run UKRI, for instance, that R&D needs to have a positive impact on society and demonstrate that it's benefiting people's lives and livelihoods. I think the underlying question to what I'm sort of hearing there is, what do we expect from the future? And I think that, well, we don't know what different parties would do in terms of research, because a lot of the sort of, you know, so if you think about Reform and the Greens on either side of the political spectrum, they haven't exactly come out with really strong, clear policies on exactly what they would do for the research sector. We can make some guesses, and there are some things that would be concerning. As an example, I went to the Reform conference, the party conference for Reform last year, and there is increasingly, there's definitely a real allergicness to talking about net zero, but the Reform voter base is very broad now, and actually the core parts of people who voted for Reform might be people who hold really strong sort of climate skeptic sort of stances, but actually more people are joining Reform now who actually have quite moderate views towards climate, or more moderate views towards some elements of things that you might just instinctively think that they wouldn't agree with. None of that is to say that I think it would be necessarily positive. So that's one of the reasons that Case is running the project we're doing at the moment, to try and understand how R&D can fit into these conversations and how we can better engage with politicians of different sort of political parties. An example is that universities in the West Midlands, where Reform already has a really strong sort of power dynamic in local government, is to think about how you're talking to politicians and make sure you're using all the same things you would do for science communication. Politicians are people, and they are audiences that you need to think about how to engage. So people who work in those areas might not foreground the words net zero because it's going to turn people off immediately, but at the same time, people who represent areas that have huge numbers of people employed in things like, you know, wind energy, they don't want their constituents to lose their jobs, because that is the best way to lose votes, is to have loads of people in your community lose their jobs and have huge unemployment rates. So there are ways to think about communicating that sort of talk to those different issues. It is definitely a concern, and this is one of the main things that we think about, that if we have an apathetic public towards science and we end up with a government that is anti-science, then we'll be in a much, much worse position than if we can bring the public with us and really use them as advocates as well as it being important just fundamentally to talk to them about research as well. Great,
thank you. I think I have a small question for you again, Rebecca. You were mentioning all this information about how you can, as a scientist, get involved in policy. How do I find that kind of information out, apart from attending such fabulous webinars as this?
What I realize is that I will actually, when I send slides and stuff, I'll send some links so that you can actually access them. So all the committees that I mentioned, like Science, Innovation and Tech committees that are in parliaments, all of the parliaments in the developed nations, they have their own websites. You can follow them on LinkedIn, you can follow them on the social medias that you use, and they'll announce that they've got an inquiry coming out. There's a database full of these parliamentary interest groups that you can see the different groups that exist. And there's various different networks. So I put up, I think, the University Policy Engagement Network, and there's lots of other places that will sort of cross-reference and cross-share where you can get resources. But I will share some links of some of these suggestions. And then the other thing I would say about sort of government consultations is that, again, some of it's about looking at websites, and sort of a lot of the government websites are okay to search, and following them on social media, because they publish the fact that they're doing a consultation on XYZ. So that is one way to sort of engage, as well as following organizations like CASE, and I'm sure like SMC and people. We will retweet and we will share and we will sort of repost all of the sorts of information and opportunities. So, but I will make sure I send some links with the slides that I sent through.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question to both of you. If you can give me a short answer and then I'll wrap up. So if there's one thing that you would like everyone who's attended this webinar to go and do afterwards, do you have a thing that you would like us to, as scientists, to do more, or maybe next time we publish a paper, or when we're looking at the news, to think about, if you have any suggestions?
Just if you're looking at the news on your area and you get frustrated, then do something about it, get out there and get involved, basically, either through doing policy work or by speaking to the media or speaking to the public directly. I guess it's just get out there and try it at least and see if it's for you, and you might find that you love it.
Thank you, Rebecca.
It feels like it's the same, but just don't be afraid of engaging with policymakers and the public. There is honestly appetite for this engagement, and ask for advice. You know, my inbox is always open. I'm sure I'll speak for Ed because he's nodding as well. So people like us are here because we really, really want to get science's message out to the people who need to hear it.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Ed and Hayley. Thank you everyone for attending. And we can continue the conversation online by following the Biochemical Society on Blue Sky, Instagram or LinkedIn. Or as Rebecca said, you can get in touch with the speakers. We welcome suggestions for future topics and speakers to feature in Biochemistry Focus webinar series. So if you have an idea for a webinar in 2026, then please submit a proposal and you can find out more information about webinars on the website. Our upcoming webinars are all listed on the website as well. So if you've missed any, also if you've missed any of the 100 plus webinars that we have already run, then you can watch them again on YouTube or on the website. And the recording from today's webinar will be available in the next couple of weeks. So finally, I want to highlight how important it is to stay connected and engage with your fellow molecular biosciences scientists, and the Biochemical Society's community of researchers and specialists help you engage with science, career development, and grow international collaborations. So I highly recommend you join the Society by visiting the website, and you can also find out more. And with that, thank you everyone, and have a nice day.
Thanks, bye everyone.
Bye.